The rest of the meal was eaten mostly in silence, and people drifted out of the kitchen in ones and twos afterwards, until Cecilia and Snape were the last ones left at the table. The silence continued while Mrs. Weasley started to clear up. Cecilia got up to help her. "I am sure Molly will not object when I ask that we go somewhere more private," said Snape. "It is vital we commence working today." "Not at all, Severus," replied Mrs. Weasley, smiling at Cecilia as she disapparated the crockery, "only for them to appear clean in the glass kitchen cupboards." "Shall we?" he said, rising from his chair. Cecilia got up too, and followed him out of the kitchen to where the office from last night, under the stairs, had been, walking past Remus, Tonks, Bill and the other wizards from lunch who were sitting in the Grimmauld Place living room. Tonks followed their wake, and winked at Cecilia. The office from last night was still actually there, but now it took on a different form. It was far larger than before, and in place of the frosted glass door with Mr. White's office stenciled on there was a large panelled oak door. He opened it and led the way. The inside was also changed. There were no high bookshelves now, the wall now only contained a chimney and fireplace. In place of the armchairs where Cecilia and Dumbledore had sat last night were two large leather settees facing one another with a high coffee table between them. The coffee table had a small vase of blue irises on it. The walls too were changed. They were a deep burgundy color, instead of the stripy gold wallpaper they had been. Snape sat down on the furthest settee. Cecilia sat down opposite to him, considering how strange he looked sitting there. His appearance, she had noticed last night, was very standoffish. His appearance with long unkempt hair and protruding hooked nose didn't help matters. Coupled with his body language, or lack of it, and general steeliness of his voice when he spoke, he certainly wasn't a people person. "I understand," said Snape, looking at the flowers as he spoke, "that you have agreed for me to collect you from your house when you are ready. Professor Dumbledore did not leave me with your address. Would you kindly oblige?" "Of course, Professor," replied Cecilia. "I'll just grab some paper from my bag." She made to stand. "No need," he replied, handing her a notebook page, and a pen. "Here you are. And, seeing as we are going to work together, I think we can dispense with Professor." The corners of his thin mouth flicked up, briefly. "Call me Severus." As she wrote on the page, Cecilia was surprised to see the writing disappear as quickly as she was forming the letters with the pen. "Security," he stated simply. "I am sure even someone like you understands the implications of what Remus Lupin said earlier." He folded the paper and put it back inside his robe. "Someone like me?" she thought. "What do you mean?" "I simply mean that, as you are not familiar with the danger that could befall you if it were discovered that we were communicating with Muggles. We feel the risk to both yourself and the Order is too great." He swallowed before continuing. "Professor Dumbledore." He paused again, eyeing Cecilia. "That is to say, Professor Dumbledore and I. We feel that in order for us to succeed in our research, we need to get to know one another on a more personal level." He swallowed and looked down. "That is, so we can find the most effective way of working together." "Ah," thought Cecilia, feeling a small amount of sympathy, "that's what's making him so nervous." "Where do you propose we start?" she asked, and chuckled to herself. "How much do you actually already know about me?" "Very little," said Snape. "All I was actually told about you was that we would be having another mole come to work for us." More silence. "This really isn't going to work unless I intervene here," thought Cecilia. "He's so closed, no amount of small talk is going to make him open up." Did she dare propose what she was considering? He would probably dismiss it as idiocy anyway, so there was nothing to lose. "What precisely do you know about me?" he inquired, the question loaded, tinged with bitterness. "I know practically nothing about you, Severus. For your information, I pay no attention to hearsay," she added, checking that the message had got through. Success. She changed tack. How much do you know about science? The science that we do. Only very recently has mole studies become a subject in its own right in which students can take an examination. When we were at school, we had a few lessons about them in our first year. About you, he quickly clarified. I have taken the trouble to look at what you use science for. But do you know anything, say, about forces? Atomic theory? Reaction rates? Yes, of course, he snapped forcefully, glaring at her. Gosh, it's no wonder he scares the children he teaches. Cecilia sighed. This was worse than talking to moody year 10s on a Friday afternoon. At least their lack of insight was because they plain and simple had hormones and they couldn't be bothered. Well, I can't believe I'm going to have to play the build up your ego card, thought Cecilia to herself, but we won't get anywhere if I don't. Probably, she began, you're thinking that you need to go over your magic. And I expect that's what you want to ask me. But I'm not sure how. She chuckled a bit, as if she had just guessed his little joke, because I don't know anything about magic and potions. You're right, of course, I don't know anything. She continued. And what I think Professor Dumbledore has in mind for us is that we go over some really difficult science, just for my benefit. Then I can compare both the science and the really simple magic that you'll be teaching me. I do thank you for your patience in giving me the chance to catch up. He continued to glare at her. Eventually he spoke. I do feel it's fair to warn you that despite what you may have heard, I am entirely open-minded about what you have to teach me. Cecilia thought back to Bath Braddle's comment, but she had noticed him brighten a little, if dull grey could be described as brighter than storm grey. He wasn't still giving anything away. You are a risk, Mrs. Frobisher, Snape continued. When I heard that you had been interviewed and had accepted, I assumed it would be in the same vein as the other moles employed by the Order. Frankly, he said, sitting back down on the settee, I thought Dumbledore was out of his mind to actually bring one here. I am going to ignore the last bit of his comment. He's really trying to divert this. Right. One last try, or this really is it? That's practically every maneuver I know, and he still won't open up. Here goes. Do or die. I think the best way we can find out about one another is to play a game together. It's a silly mole game, but it's quite easy to play. She sat back, waiting for his response. He still for a moment, then replied, continue. What we need is a dice, and some paper. We each write down 6 things about ourselves, then on the back of the paper write questions that we would like to ask the other. One of us shakes the dice first, and whichever number comes up, we ask the other person that numbered question from our paper. The other person then has to answer that numbered thing on the paper as the answer. The answer is totally stupid, of course, and we say what our actual answer to the question would be, and the question that goes with the answer. She paused. What do you think? Snape continued to stare back at her, looking at her bright eyes. He rose, and walked over to the fireplace, his back to Cecilia. I do not usually engage in, he began. He turned, and she was sure she detected uncertainty in his voice. I'm not. Cecilia got up, and walked over to him, concern on her face. We don't have to. I just thought it would be, well, fun. Just as she was about to put her hand on his arm he turned, his expression unfathomable. She quickly withdrew it, hoping he hadn't noticed. Snape rose, and folded his arms. Then, looking her in the eye, he turned to the coffee table and quickly replaced the roses with some paper and pens. A pot of tea appeared next to the paper, and with another flick of his wrist, steam emanated through the spout. 2 cups and saucers appeared next to the teapot. Would you like some tea, Mrs. Frobisher? He said, sitting back where he had sat before. Yes, that would be lovely, she said, sitting opposite him again. And, seeing as we're getting to know one another, Perhaps you'd like to be brave and call me Cecilia? He exhaled, as he poured the tea into the cups, then looked up at her. Cecilia, milk and sugar? He gestured across the table with his hand and a milk jug and sugar bowl appeared. Victory, she thought. All it takes is some good honest female cunning. Neither, she replied. But some biscuits would be nice. He presented the black tea to Cecilia and a plate of biscuits appeared next to her. When is it you are leaving? Well, I was considering this evening so I could catch the train up to Birmingham, then the local train home. I am hoping to get everything done tomorrow, and then you could meet me on Friday. Friday, it is, he confirmed, picking up the paper and pen. Shall we begin? 10 minutes later, Cecilia had finished. She'd noticed while she was thinking about her questions what Nick would have made of her, sitting there trying to break the ice with someone so completely different to herself. Snape was still writing his questions, so she sat patiently, waiting for him to finish too. Cecilia looked down at her paper, rereading the questions and answers she had written, and remembered playing this team-building game when she had joined the company he worked for, her last laboratory job. Cecilia had worked as a process chemist there, working her way up to section leader in less than a year. The work came so easy to her, that hadn't been the problem, and she wondered whether, if she had recognized that awkward feeling in her stomach that something wasn't quite right the first day she was there, if she would have had the courage to do something about it. She would never have met Nick Smith though, and spent so many wonderful night shifts laughing with him and the others, working all together like it was the most natural thing in the world. So, said Snape, bring Cecilia back down to earth. What do we do now? Cecilia uncurled her leg, which she had tucked under herself subconsciously as she was writing, and leaned forward for the dice. Now, one of us starts, and throws the dice. She threw the dice on the coffee table. It was a 4. Then, I read out the question I wrote for number 4, she said, glancing at her paper, and you give me the answer that you wrote down for number 4. She glanced at him, and read, do you have a middle name? Bath Buns, replied Snape, and she thought she noticed an expression of mirth pass over his face. I'm guessing that must be your favorite food, or else your mum had a terrible sense of humor, she said, trying to keep a straight face. Funny, he intoned. Yes, I am rather partial to Bath Buns. As for my middle name, I don't have one. Do you? Jane, replied Cecilia. She'd always hated it, so ordinary. Cecilia Jane Wells, she added. Wells? I thought your name was Frobisher. Wells is my maiden name, replied Cecilia. I'm actually thinking of changing back to it. She handed him the dice. Now it's your turn. Snape threw a 1. He looked down at his paper. How old were you when you got married? I've got 2 answers, my sister and Freya. She relied, grinning. Who are they, close friends? Well, yes they are, but not in the way you mean. They are both the 2 people I named in my will last week as my sole beneficiaries should I not come back from what I'm going to be doing here, she replied. The look on his face told Cecilia he wasn't expecting that. He was staring at her. Freya is my best friend Libby's daughter, she continued. No, I did not mean that. You are indeed sensible, Cecilia, he said, eyeing her. What we face, as I have said, affects us all. I don't expect otherwise, she replied. My acceptance of this work with you is something that I haven't undertaken lightly. And I can understand that there are some things you can't tell me. He paused and swallowed. It looked to Cecilia like he wanted to say something, but was holding back. Shall we continue? Cecilia reached across the table and shook the dice. 6, she said. Aren't you going to answer my question? He asked, eyebrow raised. 21, replied Cecilia. I got married on my 21st birthday, in fact. She looked down, hoping he couldn't see the expression on her face, and pretended to look for her question 6. Right, who is your favorite historical figure? She asked. Mole or wizard? He replied, looking at her. You're supposed to say the answer you wrote to number 6, said Cecilia, looking back. And anyway, what do you mean, mole or wizard? Do you lot have separate historical figures? You've probably heard of all of our wizarding historical figures anyway. My favorite is Merlin. Merlin? But he's a fictional character. Well, mythological at any rate, and if he did exist he was just a 6th century man. That's him, replied Snape. He really does have a deep, gravelly voice, said Cecilia to herself. Cecilia shook her head in mock annoyance. So, she continued, what was your answer for number 6? Once, he said. My answer was once. The question would have been, have I ever worked in a research capacity with anyone? And? That once would be you, Cecilia Jane Wells. She laughed, to indicate that she presumed he wasn't taking the mick. What about you? He continued. Plenty, but that was the nature of my work. Before I became a teacher, of course. Nick Smith was about the best person I've ever worked with. As square as they come, but he's proud of that. What about your historical figure? Well, let's hope you don't think he's mythological, she smiled. James, what she said, then added. Have you heard of him? Not as such, he said, awkwardly. Is he a scientist? He was, well, an engineer actually. He lived about 200 years ago. Had he not gone into business with another man, Matthew Boulton, Britain's history would have been very different. Perhaps, whilst we are working, you could tell me about him. As I said, I don't know that much about moles, he said. Well, the same goes for me, laughed Cecilia. In the reciprocal, I mean. At least you've had longer to get your head round all of this. This time yesterday I was on a train down here expecting to go to an industrial interview. For moles, she added. Not that much more time, he said. My other duties within the order have been more demanding of late. I actually found out the nature of the work in its entirety last week. What is it that we are actually going to be doing? Asked Cecilia. What is the professor hoping we'll develop? That I cannot tell you, until all the details have been finalized, replied Snape, waving his wand over the tea tray. More tea, he explained, and continued. There are far wider implications than just our collaboration. Some wizards, especially those who the Order is trying to vanquish, believe science poses a danger to us. The way you use your technology, you have to admit yourself, you've seen us using magic for almost a day now. Even an intelligent mole like you, Cecilia, has to admit that your ways are far inferior to ours. Therefore it is logical for some wizards to wish to kill you, cut out the dead wood. He saw the expression on her face. You mean these are the people, the wizards we are to fight? Whom the Order are fighting? Yes, in part, replied Snape, sipping his tea. But you have to realize. You must have noticed that some wizards even here. He paused. There are some prejudices so deeply ingrained even in those who are fighting the Dark Lord and his followers. That moles are inferior to wizards is one of them. Cecilia couldn't speak. She thought desperately for something comprehensible to say. May I ask, do you feel like this? She demanded, the volume of her voice rising. Personally, I feel there is very much to gain from our working together, he replied. His expression was unreadable and Cecilia couldn't tell if he meant it. However, he continued, you will not fail to realize that magic is far more powerful than science. But, Cecilia was on her feet now, voice raised. You speak as if we are no more than animals. Have you ever considered that due to the very fact that we cannot do magic, our skills, ingenuity, and toil in discovering and inventing engines and instruments to improve our lives, medicines, transport, that we are in fact superior? As far as logic goes, it is more sensible to say we are better than wizards, who merely have to learn a spell and wave a wand. Consider apes being taught how to use a typewriter. They can type, which is quite a sophisticated feat, I'm told, but ultimately, they are still apes. That is the image that moles present of themselves to wizards as a whole. Before she had time to reply, the door opened and Remus walked in. "Is everything okay?" he asked, concerned. We heard raised voices. "Cecilia?" He looked between her and Snape. "Lupin. What is it with you always interfering?" "We were merely having a discussion," said Snape, almost spitting the words at Remus. Remus looked questioningly at Cecilia. She noticed there was a hint of request in his eyes, as if he was daring her to disagree. He approached the coffee table. Just as Cecilia was about to say she was fine, Remus carried on. "I am merely concerned with Mrs. Furbisher's welfare. And my concern is hardly unjustified." Cecilia noticed light flash across Snape's eyes. "Mrs. Furbisher and I were just discussing the prejudices she may face from certain members of the wizard community." There was an unspoken dialogue taking place between Snape and Remus now. "I cannot begin to imagine what it is you are talking about," began Remus, carefully. "No? My, Lupin, I don't remember you having such a short memory. Maybe it's the medication. Or the company you keep. I'll assume he's been kept on his leash." He looked across to Cecilia, who was now totally at a loss. "And I am sure Mrs. Frobisher is by now aware of your opinions of her," said Remus forcefully, "hence my concern. As I said, it is not I over whom there should be concern. Now a certain mongrel on the other hand." "That was a long time ago," snapped Remus, then paused. "Cecilia," he said, turning to her. "When you've packed this afternoon, I was wondering whether you would like me to accompany you back to Euston." "It's fine, really, I'd much prefer to go on my own." She turned and smiled at Snape. "And Severus has kindly offered to collect me." "Okay then," said Remus, glancing back between Cecilia and Snape. "I'll leave you to it." When Remus had closed the door, Cecilia looked back at Snape. His granite expression had reappeared, and he had paced over to the fireplace, arms folded. She wondered what they were going to do now. "I have many failings, Cecilia," he began. "However, I can assure you, I do not have that prejudice." She looked at him, his expression stony. "You do," thought Cecilia, "but there's a lot more here than I could have possibly imagined." "I think I'll go and pack," said Cecilia, making to go. "Thanks for the tea. See you Friday." 88,888,888. The rest of her afternoon had been an interesting one. When Cecilia had walked out of the meeting with Snape, she had made to go to her room to pack. The wizards who had been at lunch were no longer in the living room, but she had found herself looking round the room for some presence that she could sense there. The book Remus had loaned her earlier was still in the living room and, considering whether she should take it home with her. When she'd carried her bag down an hour later, she spoke to Mrs. Weasley about making some sandwiches for the train journey. She insisted she make them herself, while Molly watched in amazement. At least Cecilia assumed it was amazement. She seemed both aghast and in awe as Cecilia buttered the bread herself and sliced cucumber and tomato. Then Mr. Weasley apparated into the kitchen, scaring Cecilia half to death and making her drop the tin foil. He was very keen to talk to her, and within 10 minutes they were having an interesting discussion about engineering and science, while he keenly questioned her. Cecilia didn't mind one bit. It made a refreshing change from school children, and it wasn't until Tunks, Bill and Charlie joined them that she noticed it was nearly 6 o'clock. She'd have to leave now, else she'd miss the train. Mr. Weasley insisted that he accompanied her to the station, and Cecilia wondered secretly whether it was because he wanted to travel on the London Underground. "We'll be seeing you soon then," said Tonks, as Cecilia made her way into the living room to collect her bag. "I expect so. Professor Snape is coming to collect me from home, then we're starting work," replied Cecilia. Tonks sniggered. "What?" asked Cecilia. "He didn't seem too bad," she said, reproachfully. "He seemed very weird, tacit, but yet in a small way, almost tragic, like a spell of cold rain on a summer's afternoon." She wondered how they would get on working together. He was so very different to herself. "Just you wait," said Bill, shuddering in jest. "You'll be given detention within a week." "Or worse," said Charlie, laughing. "What?" he asked, as Mrs. Weasley raised her eyebrows at him. "I'll just take your bag," said Mr. Weasley. "There's something I must do quickly before we go," and disappeared through a door Cecilia had failed to notice until now, at the far end of the living room. Failed, she thought, or it hadn't been there. She wondered whether she would ever get used to this dot magic. "Well, I think I've got everything," said Cecilia, looking round. Then she remembered mysterious mythology. Maybe she should take it with her. Remus had given it to her, after all. She picked it up from the coffee table. Tonks looked at her, and back at the book. "Remus gave you that?" asked Tonks, questioningly, eyebrows raised. Mrs. Weasley coughed and turned away, and walked back to the kitchen, beckoning Bill and Charlie to follow her. "Yes," said Cecilia slowly. "Is that a problem?" Tonks's expression seemed like a mixture between incredulity and concern. But before Tonks could reply, Remus came down the stairs. "Are you off home now, Cecilia?" he asked as he approached them. He noticed Tonks's expression, and gave her a look, which Cecilia took to mean later. "I was going to the book you lent me back home. Is that okay with you?" She wouldn't normally have asked. But whatever was going on, she was determined to play her part thoroughly. "Of course," he said carefully. "Why would there be a problem?" He looked back at Tonks, whose face had gone blank, as if she was trying not to give away anything. She would have got away with it not been for the fact that her hair was flicking through every conceivable color, presumably out of her control. "Have a safe trip," said Tonks stiffly, and headed towards the kitchen. "What was that all about?" said Cecilia, and before he could answer, she continued, "I understand there are plenty of other things that I don't know. That much is clear. Whether for security, or whether you think I am too stupid to understand because I'm a mole," she thought grimly. Remus must have read her thoughts, because he came closer to her, and looked her straight in the eye. She hadn't noticed yesterday, but, underneath the 1940s public school geography teacher look, there was definitely something. He sighed, and she could feel his warm breath on her cheek. "The book that I gave you is very old, and Tonks is surprised that I gave it to you because it is one of the only things that I have of my family's. I expect she thinks that it is strange that I did." "I'd be inclined to agree," said Cecilia, not breaking eye contact. "And I bet he'll come up with some flimsy excuse for my keeping it. Not that I wouldn't like to," she thought. "I've never seen anything like it. We think this, at least something inside this is the key to what you're trying to discover. You and Snape," he said, almost spitting at the word Snape. "The book was written hundreds of years ago, but many of the stories still exist as myths and legends, just as to muggles, wizards such as Merlin and Gandalf are myths. Wizards, despite them thinking they know everything, actually pales in comparison to what muggles as a whole know about nature and science. There is definitely something fundamental that bridges magic and non-magic. You know about science, Cecilia, which is the advantage we have over the enemy." "But I don't know what I am supposed to be finding out," she replied, still looking at him, at his eyes. What pale eyes, she thought, as if moonlight was shimmering from within them. And besides, Professor Dumbledore said that if I were to tell anyone, then I'd instantly forget about my employment here. What happens if anyone reads it? She held the book up towards Remus, trying not to notice there were only a few inches between them. "Keep it, please. I would really like you to keep it," he said, pressing the book into her hands. "Security-wise, if anyone reads it, they'll just think they've been reading Mole fairy tales." "It is beautiful," she conceded, looking down at the front cover, then back at Remus. He smiled, and Cecilia could feel herself smiling too. Someone coughed. It was Mr. Weasley. "Ready to go?" he said. Cecilia turned, and nodded. "Thank you, Remus. It's lovely." She held out her hand, and he shook it. Then she turned and walked over to Mr. Weasley. "We'll see you soon," said Remus. They left through the front door and, stepping out into the balmy July evening, Cecilia noticed the houses either side moved together, as if closing the void number 12 was leaving. Not for the first time Cecilia marveled at this opportunity to see something most people did not. Mr. Weasley strode down the steps, and Cecilia followed. Then, she realized she still had Remus's book in her hand. She stopped Mr. Weasley, so she could put it in her bag, before continuing on. "Do you think that you'll be able to do all that Dumbledore is asking of you?" asked Mr. Weasley. They walked the quarter-mile to the nearest underground station. "I don't know what he is actually asking of me, to be honest," replied Cecilia, "but in general, I think so. Having said that, it's not every day that you find out the existence something as fundamental as magic." "Some wizards feel the same about non-magic," said Mr. Weasley. "The members of the Order you've seen, and Molly and I, we're all used to the non-magic world. My department deals with wizard-mole relations, for example. But there are some wizards who have never heard about moles and are horrified when they find out." He smiled at Cecilia. "Their upbringing," he said simply. Cecilia shivered as a breeze caught them. As they walked, she thought back to that afternoon, the time she had spent with Snape, and thought to herself that what had been unspoken was probably more significant than what they had said to one another. And what on earth had Snape and Remus been on about? "Remus," she mused, thinking about those pale eyes that had stared into hers. "I'll look at that book when I'm on my own, at home. Then I can try to work out what the heck he was talking about," she thought, casting her mind back to their conversation. "Is this it?" asked Mr. Weasley, as they walked towards the bright lights of the small suburban underground station twinkled in the balmy summer evening. Their journey to Euston was hardly surreptitious. Mr. Weasley had insisted he purchase the tickets from the machine, but spent the first 5 minutes trying to put in 2 rather large gold coins which Cecilia had never seen the like of before into the machine until she handed him a £10 note. Then he tried to walk through the turnstile onto the underground, before turning round to look at Cecilia pushing through it. "Wizards," she thought, "superior. My foot. Are you going to be okay getting back to Grimmauld Place?" Cecilia asked, when they had got to Euston, thinking Mr. Weasley would probably be stopped for being drunk and disorderly if he tried to go back on his own. Fine, said Mr. Weasley, "I'll just—" and he motioned, clicking his fingers, indicating he would apparat. She took her bag, which he had kindly offered to carry for her, and went to the ticket office. Her train would be leaving in 10 minutes, she noticed, so Cecilia purchased her ticket and waved back to Mr. Weasley, to indicate everything was okay. He waved back. Then she heard a loud bang, and a cloud of smoke filled the space where Mr. Weasley had been standing. Ticket in hand, Cecilia stood still for a moment, then turned, straight-faced, and walked in the direction of the platforms, forcing herself not to turn round at the confusion that was about to unfold behind her. It wasn't until she actually boarded the train, found her seat and sat down, that she allowed herself to laugh, and once she started it took some other passengers asking whether she was all right some 10 minutes into the journey before she could finally control it. 88,888,888. 2.5 hours later she arrived at Birmingham New Street. It was dark now, and she pulled her bag from the seat next to her onto her shoulder. On the journey up she had been thinking about everything that had gone on over the last early 2 days. The most effective way she could rationalize it was sort it out into boxes in her head, with interrelated threads linking them. She crossed the mezzanine to platform 2A and sat on the platform waiting for her local train. The air had become much colder and she pulled a cardigan from her bag, while she waited. 10 minutes to go. She sat down on one of the metal seat and thought. There existed a world where people pretty much like herself but could do magic. Move things by magic, cause phenomena to happen. They lived with it, used it. To her mind, magic couldn't be isolated as a difference between her and them. It was innate, just as the ability for some people to be able to draw and paint spectacularly without any training whatsoever. Instinct. A train, not stopping at New Street, hurtled through another platform behind Cecilia, making her lose her concentration. She looked at the digital clock. 21.57, 7 minutes before the train was due to depart. But this difference, she thought, was enough to make wizards hate non-magical people, muggles, because we weren't like them. It could certainly be called prejudicial, just as some people differentiate because of color, race, you name it. But whereas racial prejudice arises from ignorance, this arises from their ability to be exactly like us. Plus. Human plus. She sighed, and tried to clear a thinking space in her mind. Isn't that how you could think of humans, muggles then, compared to animals, animals plus? Humans can speak and communicate in what we think as more superior to animals, so we treat them as inferior. Isn't that the same situations for how some wizards think of humans? Cecilia shuddered at the thought of where her mind was wandering off to. How accurate were her assumptions. She'd even compared Snape's attitude of assumed superiority to muggles being treated like animals. And what had he said about muggles being like apes taught how to type? No, she thought firmly. I am going to have to do this, me. Prove that we're more than just animals plus. That was it, she said, realization dawning. She had been having trouble actually rationalizing to herself why she had taken on this work, when all logical signals in her head should have been telling her something was wrong. Now she had had time to think about it, and reason out her instincts. She felt much better, knowing that she must have reasoned it out subconsciously in order for few doubts to have bothered her. That's why she had felt right in accepting to Dumbledore. And in any case, he was very nice, genuine. So were all the others, maybe a little bit mad though. Mr. Weasley could even rival many of the non-wizard Anoraks with his keenness on engineering and all things mechanical. Just then, a 2-carriage diesel pulled into the station, and slowed at the points. Cecilia stood up, and picked up her bag. A couple of other people had arrived on the platform since she had got there. She walked over to the carriage door, and waited for the passengers to exit. Then she boarded behind the other passengers, and after she had found a seat, swung her bag onto the seat next to her. The weight of the bag reminded her that mysterious mythology was what was extra inside. Tonks had seemed ever so surprised that Remus had given it to her. No, not just surprised, thought Cecilia, a bit indignant too. How nice he seems to be, she thought. Though there was an air of sadness there. It doesn't matter, she thought. Perhaps Professor Snape will be able to fill me in, she thought, considering the afternoon. Or maybe not. The train pulled away and Cecilia tried to concentrate on her forthcoming work, but her mind kept betraying her. She couldn't help her thoughts switching back to Remus. 88,888,888. She arrived at her front door just after midnight. the train taking far longer than it normally did to Edgeford. She was surprised therefore to see all the lights on, and her stereo on. Backstreet Boys sounded worse out here than they normally did. She opened the front door, and walked into the lounge. There were a few cans of opened lager on the coffee table, and the patio doors were open at the back. Cecilia put her bag down in the hall, and walked through the lounge. Just then her sister Amy walked in through the patio doors, her boyfriend of the moment walking with her arms round her waist. She stopped. "Sec," she said. "Thought you were going to be away for a bit." She turned off the stereo and sat on the sofa, boyfriend standing next to her, looking sheepish. "So I see," said Cecilia, too tired to be too cross. "Just came back for a few things." Patrick came over because Mrs. Newman next door phoned Mum. "She thinks there were prowlers in the back garden the last night. She thought we should stay to keep an eye out," she added, glancing up at Patrick. Well, Mum knows best, thought Cecilia, wondering how quickly Amy had volunteered. 0.5 seconds after, probably. "Yeah, fine, I'm just going to get on and have a shower," said Cecilia, noticing the crestfallen look pass between Amy and Patrick. She knew it was a mean what she was going to do, but as eldest, she was obliged to make her little sister's life at least a bit difficult sometimes. "Patrick, do you think you could make a pot of tea?" she asked. He scuttled away, silently. "What did you have to go and do that for?" asked Amy angrily. A cool breeze was coming in through, so Cecilia got up and closed the patio doors. "I'm going to be away from a while, working," said Cecilia. "I'm going to need someone to keep an eye on this place. It's going to be for at least 6 months. She smiled inwardly to herself, noticing Amy's demeanor brighten. "So I think one night in my own house before I go isn't too much to ask." "So, what's this wonderful job like then?" asked Amy, changing the subject. "You certainly look a hell of a lot better than you did a couple of weeks ago." "Well, I haven't have Mum nagging at me to pull myself together for the last couple of days," said Cecilia. "She's not that bad," said Amy reproachfully. "She's got your best interests at heart, you know." Cecilia thought about the time her mum had stormed into school demanding to know why nothing was being done to stop her daughter being bullied. To the headmaster. In assembly. In front of the whole school. Yes, Mum always has her best interests at heart. It's just the way she went about showing it sometimes. "I know, Ames," said Cecilia, "but I'm not as used to her ways anymore." Just then, Patrick re-entered the room with a pot of tea and 3 mugs. There were also a few biscuits on a plate. He saw her notice them. "Thought you might be hungry," he said, putting the tray onto the coffee table. "We'll be off to Patrick's after this," said Amy, pouring the tea as Patrick sat down next to Amy. He nodded, looking warily at Cecilia. The power, she thought, chuckling to herself. "I was just telling Sec that Mrs. Newman told Mum she'd heard prowlers," said Amy, "and we popped in to make sure everything was okay." "I'm grateful," said Cecilia, selecting a bourbon biscuit. "Hope you both can do as good a job when I go back to work." "You had a call this afternoon," continued Amy. "Nick, wanting to know if you were interested working back at the lab. Said he hoped you'd turned down the patent office because, and I quote, you are too good for those soft southern bastards." "I'll call him tomorrow," said Cecilia, yawning and thinking about her lovely soft bed. And about getting up and not being screamed at by a picture of someone who was dead or being offered shopping tips by the bathroom mirror. 88,888,888. She woke up early, with the sun shining through the window. Her bed was lovely and soft and she didn't want to get out of it. Amy, bless her, had changed the covers. Cecilia tried not to think why, and she was reaping the benefits. She turned over, to go back to sleep, and closed her eyes, glorying in the luxury that were her own white linen sheets. She was home. Cecilia never thought she'd miss home as much as she had done over the past long 2 days. Those days when she had barely moved off the sofa, her mind beguiling her into a false sense of security that she was content, only to jab her sharply in the cerebellum to alert her to the events of the most painful moments of these last few months. Now she just felt happy. What was causing that? Oh yes, the job she had just accepted, she thought. I've got something to look forward to, a bright point on an otherwise dull horizon. A bright point, created by magic nevertheless. I think the only way I am going to be able to cope with this is to treat it like any other job that I'm not familiar with, and try to accept that magic is a quirk of their nature. Like double-jointedness. Genetic. She glanced over to her bedside table. Mysterious Mythology was lying there. Cecilia had tried to read a bit last night in bed, but had been overcome with tiredness and had discarded it. I'll look at it later, she thought, turning over. The sunlight gradually grew more intense as Cecilia lay wrapped up in her own covers. I'm home, she thought, for the 100th time. When the sun was positively cooking her room, she decided to get up and think about having some breakfast. She glanced over to her alarm clock, 9:45. Blimey, thought Cecilia, better make that brunch, and she got out of bed for a quick shower. The toast was doing under the grill when Amy popped by, an hour later. Sorry about last night, she said, helping herself to tea. Patrick was just keeping me company. "'S okay, Amy," replied Cecilia, retrieving a piece of toast that was nearly overdone. "I was young once too, remember?" She grinned at her sister, and Amy grinned back. "Are you serious about my looking after the house while you're away? How long for?" "Definitely serious," replied Cecilia, joining Amy at the kitchen table. "My accommodation's close to work," she said, thinking about 12 Grimmauld Place, "and it's free. There's enough money in the bank to cover the mortgage on direct debit, but you'll have to sort out the bills, and telephone yourself, okay?" "Great," said Amy, "anything to get out from under Mum's wing for a bit. Have you got a number I can call you on? Emergencies, and the like?" "Not as such," said Cecilia, carefully, "but I'll call when I can. I've got an address though. You can write, if you like." She saw Amy grimace, and clarified, "It's for emergencies, so you don't have to use it unless there's anything vital you need to tell me. Mum wants to see you, anyway. She said so last night." Would you believe she was waiting up for me? Honestly. Anyone would think I was 12. Amy helped herself to another piece of toast, smothering it in jam. Cecilia would believe it. Mum was very overbearing at times. Through it all though, Cecilia knew she just had her daughter's best interests at heart. Amy would come to see it, in time. "I probably won't be able to call today, I'm going to be really busy today. Does Tony next door to Mum know anyone who might like to buy the car?" "Dunno," said Amy offhandedly, mouthful of jammy toast. "You might not be able to get a buyer if you're only going to be around for a couple of days." Cecilia knew where this was leading, but it would be more amusing watching Amy convince her not to sell it for her own ulterior motives. "What do you think I should do with it?" Cecilia got up to reboil the kettle. "There's no one I know offhand who could afford to buy the Alpha." Despite Amy's numerous office jobs, and career plans, money left her hands as if it were water. "Well, you'll probably need it when you get back, and if you sell it you won't get a decent price at such short notice." True, thought Cecilia. If I were to look after it for you, I could use it now and again, to get shopping for Mum. And then it'd still be yours. Who said reverse psychology didn't work? 88,888,888. It was nearly 5 o'clock when Cecilia got off the bus a little down the road from Aunt Libby's. She half expected her friend not to be in. She tried to call her from town when she was shopping and there'd been no answer. She made her way up the garden path, and rang the bell anyway. She had spent the rest of the morning after breakfast finding out some old books she'd had when she did her degree, and also some science revision guides and A-level books. She'd looked at the small mountain on her study floor, trying to narrow down the selection, but finding reasons to keep them. It was difficult. I mean, what do you teach someone who doesn't know what science even is? It wasn't like there was a national curriculum scheme of work. She'd had the same problem when she'd called in to see Nick, although a high percentage of the time spent at her old work had been taken up by their gossiping and banter, which hadn't taken long to fall back into. I'll get you some of the basics, pipettes, reflux condensers, glassware, then I can drop some more off when I'm next down London. Wish you weren't going though, Sec, the place hasn't been the same without you. The guy we replaced you with, fantastic, technically, but doesn't have your point of view on breaking into Biomed and stealing the GAR. I actually need them sooner than that. Do you think you would come by mine tomorrow? You're a hard woman to please, Mrs. Frobisher, said Nick, winking. It'll have to be early, say 7:30. So tea and toast on the table for 6 a.m. then? Nick was always early for everything. You've got it. Nick, she though, ringing Libby's bell again, life just isn't the same without you, either. Just as she turned to walk away, the door opened and her best friend in all the world shouted, "And it's about bloody time, Cecilia Wells. Just where do you think you're going?" Cecilia turned round grinning broadly. She walked back up to her front door, and was met legs on by Freya, Libby's 7-year-old daughter. "Auntie Celia, Auntie Celia!" she cried, as Cecilia bent lower to greet her. "Mummy said we wouldn't see you for a long time." "Look," Freya held out a drawing on crinkly lining paper. "I drew you and Tipex and the goldfish." "Freya darling," said Cecilia, kissing her on the cheek. "What an outstanding picture. Did you do that all by yourself?" Freya nodded, and grabbed her sleeve. "Auntie Celia's coming," laughed her mother, relieving Cecilia of the cake. "Tea, my dear?" she said, closing the front door and heading to the kitchen. "Lovely," murmured Cecilia following her, glancing round the hall. "My, you have worked hard to get this finished." Cecilia had remembered it last with the plaster exposed, with Libby's husband promising to finish it off. Derek finally did it. "Look what my fantastic husband can do when he puts his mind to it," said Libby, then noticing a flicker across Cecilia's face, quickly added, "Oh my darling, I am sorry." Cecilia sat down on a chair. "Let's not talk about that now. That job I went for interview for," she began. "You've got a new job, Auntie Celia?" asked Freya, sitting herself on Cecilia's lap. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to work in a lab, like when I used to work with Nick. You remember Nick, don't you?" "Yes," said Freya, giggling. "I like him. He was funny. He kept making me jump and tickling me at Christmas." "Yes, he did," said Cecilia, remembering Nick, the I Love Children, on Toast Man. "And then you went to sleep on him, do you remember, and he wouldn't let us move you." She turned back to Libby. "He definitely missed his calling, that man, teaching year ones." Libby laughed. "You got the job, then? That's such good news, Sec. I'm too pleased for you. Tell me everything, you were so mysterious about the interview." "All in good time," said Cecilia. She wanted to wait until she had Libby's full attention. Anyway, the interview consisted of very little that she could remember at the time, which of course made perfect sense now. "Have you seen your mum yet?" continued Libby, pouring the just-boiled kettle water into the teapot. "Freya, can you get some mats out, there's a good girl." She opened the Marks and Spencer carrot cake and put it on a plate with a knife, and got out some side plates. "Yes, I popped in this morning, before I went shopping. She didn't criticize me at all. In fact, she said I looked happier than she'd seen me in months." It was Amy who was the topic of conversation, actually. Speaking of shopping, she bent down and retrieved a purple box from her bag. "This is for Freya's birthday," she said, noticing her goddaughter's eyes light up. "Seeing as I won't be here for her birthday." "Ah!" Freya complained. "Is it all right if she has this now, Mum?" said Cecilia, turning her head towards her friend. It wouldn't have mattered if Libby hadn't have nodded. Freya already had the box in her hands, looking up at her mum, with wide-eyed pleasing that only a child can get away with convincingly. "You can open it now," said Libby, setting the teapot and cups down on the table, and sitting down opposite Cecilia and her daughter. "But then I'm going to put it up for your actual birthday." While Freya hungrily dived into the box, Cecilia looked across at her friend. She seemed happy and contented as always. She'd known Libby since they were 11, braving the new horizon of secondary school together. Cecilia was dreading it, hoping that she would remember her way round and not get lost. They'd sat by each other in form on the first day, and the rest, as they say, is history. "How's Amy doing?" asked Libby. "Up to her 100th yet?" "Probably," replied Cecilia, sipping her tea that Libby had poured. Her sister's appetite for the opposite sex was legend. Look mummy," cried Freya, holding the present in her hands, a beautiful gold bangle, engraved with small loops. It had been given to Cecilia by her grandmother when she was about Freya's age. Cecilia had had it engraved with Freya's date of birth on its inside. Libby gasped, then regained composure. "Freya," she said to her daughter, "pop it back in the box, and put it on Mummy's dressing table." She obeyed her mother, and hurried upstairs. "It's stunning and Freya will treasure it." Libby leaned across the table and held Cecilia's hand. "But I've got to ask, are you sure?" "Of course, Libs," replied Cecilia. "I know I said I would be keeping it for my child, but well, after Tim, after everything, there's not much chance of my having children. Freya is like my own daughter. Ever since you put her into my arms when she was hours old. There's no one else I'd like to have it." Libby squeezed her hand, and gave her a look, their look of friendship, unspoken. It could say 1,000 things, Cecilia knew. Here it meant, "You've got over the worst, and I'm proud of you." Half an hour later, Freya bathed and bedded, a good old bottle of wine opened and Queen's Greatest Hits, the 3-volume version, on as background music. Cecilia was ready to talk about her job. She was aware it would take an awful amount of effort to effectively lie to her best friend, and despite trying to tell herself that it wasn't lying, just editing the truth, even Cecilia didn't believe it. "How long will you be away?" asked Libby, curling into the sofa with her glass of wine. If Cecilia didn't know otherwise, she could almost convince herself that they were 16 again, telling each other secrets and gossiping in Libby's bedroom.